Well, it's a privilege to be here tonight. And I'm going to be speaking about citizens' power with respect to this book I wrote, Little Bets, and Fuse Core, and some other experiences. And so I just was asked to describe in a very personal way my story, which is not something I've been asked to do in a speech, which is a privilege, and I hope it doesn't bore you. We have some pictures here that maybe only a mother could love. You know, I was born in Northern California. It's my dad. And I'll share just one personal anecdote. My middle name is Eagle. My parents thought it would be great to name their son Peter Eagle Sims because I was born in July 1976, the bicentennial month and year, so that's just get the laughs out of the way now. That's not my mom. That's one of her best friends at the time, but that is my dad. And we moved up to the foothills of the Sierras when I was 3. That's my Uncle Joe, who's a truck driver, and I grew up in a wooded area, rural area, and appreciated very much people like my Uncle Joe, citizens who worked hard. He worked usually 14 hours a day and had a Coors on the weekend, as you can see. And that's me and my Uncle Joe's boots. So that's kind of where I come from. This is my grandfather, Grandpa Judge, and he was a judge in California for a long time, very respected judge, and that's my brother and me with Grandpa when we're 6 and 4. But justice is a very big theme in my family. My father was a judge as well for 30 years, so that's a big passion of mine. And my mom's an artist. She's a photographer. So my dad introduced me to East Coast schools. My brother and I both went to Bowdoin College in Maine. I don't know, there's at least one Bates graduate in the audience here, but maybe nobody else has heard of Bowdoin. But it was a really good education, but for a small town boy from a tiny town in Northern California, it was a big adjustment, hard adjustment. And when I was in my spring of my first year, I visited Washington, D.C., and my mother, photographer, knew she worked very closely with Tim Russert's wife. I don't know how many people here know Tim Russert, but this was kind of my role model growing up. He was the only guy I knew outside a big town, outside a small town rather, and this is a picture that's kind of speaks for itself. But this is what Tim Russert was all about. He invited me to come see Meet the Press. That's Brian Williams and Bob Novak and a couple of others. And he invited me to come to this recording and Meet the Press. And afterwards, he said, "Peter, come on up, let's take a picture." And of course, I wasn't ready for this at all. There in my cow hat. But Tim Russert was a really amazing person, and I feel really lucky to have met him at the age of 11. He was what I think of as an American trustee. There's at least one person here from Buffalo, I know. And this is a person who, yes, your uncle went to high school with Tim. This guy was just kind of an amazing force of nature guy. He really believed in the American citizen. He believed in educating Uncle Joe. He believed in educating Aunt Liz about what was going on in politics. And I think when he passed away a few years ago, it was a tragic, sad moment for the country, and for those of us who had the privilege to know him. But that spirit of trusteeship is something that we need to rekindle in this country. And I think there are a lot of people, including a number of people here in the audience, who are examples of people in the baby boom who are trustees. We need those types. But on this day, I was really struggling to get through Bowdoin College. So when Tim took me to the train station after this, he said, "How's it going?" I said, "Well, I'm really struggling." I said, "You know, I got in D's on my first papers." And I told him it was really hard to compete with the prep school kids who had come from different backgrounds and really well prepared for college. And he said, "Peter, just remember one thing." He said, and this is advice Daniel Patrick Moynihan, senator, had told him. He said, what they know you can learn, what you know they can never learn. So I carried that advice in my back pocket, and when he passed away, it brought a lot of tears, actually. Most empowering and wise advice I've ever received. And when it came to getting out of college, I always had this passion to do social good, but also wanted to go where the action was. And to me, that was my observation, very simplistic view of the world based on being a student at Bowdoin College. That was to go work in venture capital. So Summit Partners is a premier venture capital firm. I ended up getting a job, luckily. Worked in Boston for Summit, had the chance to interact with entrepreneurs all around the U.S. Who were inspiring. I got to interact with them daily, hear their stories about starting from a business from scratch with credit cards and building up through a lot of toil and hard work to build companies of great value. Excuse me. I also had the chance to go to Europe with Summit, move with a partner there, and we founded the office in Europe, learned a lot about European investing, which was something we knew nothing about, and I still know very little about, despite spending 2 years there, but saw what it was like in Europe to be an entrepreneur, and came back with a great appreciation for what American entrepreneurship stands for. And I'm not a big fan in the term American exceptionalism, but there's one way I will definitely apply that, and that is when it comes to entrepreneurship. And so the dream was to get back to California, and the opportunity from London to get to home was really to go to business school and continue my studies. And I had a moment, I was asked to share vulnerabilities in this talk. I had a moment working at Summit. I had a great experience at Summit, but I had a moment where I just couldn't get out of bed one day. I just didn't feel a sense of meaning in my work. And this went on for weeks. And my colleague, the partner who I moved over there with, was very sympathetic. He wanted to help in any way he could, but it was just one of those moments, I'm sure some of you have had them, when you just can't find that sense of purpose. And so I knew I had to make a change. I just didn't know what. So I was fortunate enough to get into business school in California at Stanford, and started to study and try to understand how to connect my values, what was important, with what I was doing, so that I could be myself and be successful. That was really the goal, just be able to be myself, be the same person from Colfax, California, and make an impact in my work. And went through a lot of reflection to try to understand the answers to that, and ended up meeting someone who came to speak, Bill George, who was a professor at Harvard Business School at the time. He gave a talk on authentic leadership that really resonated. That idea of authenticity is something that just always has grabbed me, and I'm sure many of you, and Bill George wrote a book on authentic leadership. So I really wanted to understand, how to connect values and authenticity with my work. We ended up starting a class at Stanford, and that led to working very closely with Bill, because he was starting a class that was very similar at HBS. And we ended up co-authoring this book called True North, Discover Your Authentic Leadership, which was a chance to interview people ranging from Wendy Kopp of Teach for America to Howard Schultz of Starbucks, to a lot of people who I never would have had a chance to talk with, and just learn about their personal struggles, their personal journey. And one of the key things we learned is that development, personal development, leadership development is not linear. It's, in fact, very nonlinear. And in fact, we think that if we're going to be able to get from point A to point B, we're going to get ahead of everyone else by getting that next rung up the ladder. Well, what we found is that everybody who was over the age of 40 who we interviewed had a significant, what we call, crucible. This is a term that Warren Bennis, who recently passed away, pioneered. But the idea is just that when you have a severe setback, whether it's a loss of a job or the loss of maybe a relationship, something that causes you to take a step back and reflect, that's actually one of the most valuable times in your life and in your personal and leadership development. And we found that once people went through those crucibles, painful as they were, they came out with much greater self-awareness, and they were able to be much more effective as leaders afterwards. So we called that the transition from I, focusing on yourself, to we focus. Many of you are already through that, I think. And if you haven't, well, it's all good if you just view it as a learning experience. So then I got introduced, as was mentioned, to the Stanford D School, and George Kemble of the Stanford D School taught me design. I was blown away. I never thought of myself as creative. Learned these methods for prototyping and observation, and you can really learn these methods for creativity. And it was the same methods that I had seen entrepreneurs using as they built their businesses from scratch. So George and I would talk about this, and I said, that's just fascinating to see that there's these two ways of thinking that can come together, and George agreed, and so I thought, well, that's important. I want to write a book about that to try to help, hopefully inspire and motivate other people to become more creative. Because I think creativity really comes down to your willingness to try a lot of things, to be willing to make mistakes, to be able to learn from setbacks, and to be willing to fail. So Little Bets came out a couple years ago. The thesis of Little Bets is that if you look at the great companies of Silicon Valley even, none of them began as great ideas that ended up in the same place as the initial idea. You know, YouTube began as a dating website. I don't know if you knew that. Google began as a library search project where Larry Page and Sergey Brin were working to try to understand how to prioritize library searches for the Stanford Library. They solved that problem by figuring that if you could determine how many sources pointed to a given source and prioritize search results based on that algorithm, you could figure out which books were most relevant. Well, they applied that same basic algorithm to obviously a much, much larger problem and discovered this incredible company. Starbucks, as Aisha was mentioning, I'm also a fan of Starbucks. This began as a company called Il Giornale, where Howard Schultz went to Italy, came back, wanted to create the Italian coffee company in the United States, and it had nonstop opera music playing. The menus were all in Italian. The baristas were wearing bow ties, and there were no chairs. So, you know, completely different than what we experience today. So as Howard Schultz says, you have to be willing to make mistakes. Okay, so that's a core part of the thesis to this small bets. You know, when we're doing something where we know all the information, use the planning mentality, use the analytical reasoning that we all have from our education. But when you're doing something new, determine what you can afford to lose. And this is all based on decision-making research that actually shows that this is how expert entrepreneurs work when they're doing something new. So you probably are making a lot of small bets already. This crowd is full of entrepreneurial types, but this is the core thesis of the book. And out of all that grew this nonprofit FuseCore, this social venture that Aisha and I co-founded. And what we do at FuseCore is very simple. We find great entrepreneurial leaders who are doing things. This is Erica Dimmler. She was working as a producer for CNN. She was following around presidential candidates and didn't find meaning in that work. She wanted to do something more meaningful, and she wanted to make a social impact. So she spent a year working for the mayor of Sacramento, Kevin Johnson, as a FuseCore fellow, and we paid her a stipend. She tackled this problem of how to bring healthy eating into the Sacramento-fied school district. So they started with understanding the kids, empathizing with the kids and the parents, and building up solutions with lots of prototypes and small bets to see what was going to work. In the meantime, she partnered with Alice Waters, you know, of Chez Panisse. She partnered with UC Davis. She partnered with philanthropy groups. She created a joint venture. She partnered with corporations. Most importantly, she had a life-changing experience and is continuing to do this type of work today. Another example, Jeremy Goldberg just finished his fellowship in San Jose working for the mayor there. He created a talent partnership, Silicon Valley Talent Partnership, that brings together corporate resources, philanthropy resources, other community resources to solve problems. Whether it's how do you do parking more effectively? We need a parking app. Let's go to people at eBay and figure out who's the best person to give us some resources there. They raised $1 million from the Knight Foundation to fund this, and they have a former Cisco executive now running it full-time. So that's FuseCore. We do 15 to 20 of these catalysts a year working with mayors, governors, and social entrepreneurs. And at least Rodrigo is going to be potentially interested in bringing a FuseCore fellow to work with him. If there are others, happy to have that conversation. Because you know what? From the top down, we had a chance to go to 10 Downing Street last year. Nobody knows the answers to these problems that we face. Same is true at the White House. They need, from the bottom up, people like us to solve these problems. They're sitting around saying, you know, holy whatever, you know, we don't know what to do. Because this world is so complex and these problems are so convoluted. There's no way people can have the answers. Just as it's impossible for even the best entrepreneurs to have all the answers when they start. So I think the future is going to be a lot about finding ecosystems of people, especially like-minded ecosystems. I wrote an article on Andreessen Horowitz recently, building an ecosystem that's just completely disrupting Silicon Valley venture capital. Fascinating to see. I think we're going to see that in the corporate and also much more in the nonprofit world and political world. And so that brings me to my final closing points, which is this room's full of these types of people, black sheep, right? I hear laughs even when this goes up on the screen, right? You feel like you've been a black sheep for a long time, but What does it mean? What do I mean by this? Well, just you need a relentless desire to come up with new approaches to solving problems. I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here, right? This is nothing new for you, but when you think about new ecosystems for solving social problems and for citizen power changing, I think we can really start to think in terms of forming groups that are united by a set of values. So we have at Black Sheep 5 simple values, creative values, and we say one simple rule: 5% of your time goes to social good work. It's a loose guild of creative thinkers and doers, and you'll hear much more on that going forward. Some people you may be familiar with there. I want to end on this. This is my Uncle Joe. Again, he's now in his 60s. I spend a day with him every year in his truck. He's a logger, and you know, it's hard to watch. It's in some ways, because he's not a person to ever complain, but you can see the toll that the work has taken on his body, and I can't imagine how much longer he's going to be able to do it. But he doesn't have the resources to retire. He is an exemplary example of you know, a lot of what's happening with a lot of people in this country right now. They are working just as hard as ever, but it's just extremely hard. And I think we need to have a lot of empathy for what's going on in the country, and to realize that we can help with solutions. So one of my uncle's favorite lines is that, you know, he says, we've forgotten who's the boss in this country. He says, the citizen is the boss. So here's a person who's thinking about solving these social problems every day in his truck. He says he has the best corner office in the world. And we need to listen to him, because the answer is not Barack Obama. The answer is not some heroic leader, Teddy Roosevelt, riding in on a horse. The answer is all of us. The answer is you. The answer is me. The answer is Uncle Joe. And we have to shift the power conversation in this country so that we're empowered as a country to be a democracy again. So this is us, Black Sheep, having, you know, kind of, I don't think all this has to be hard, and, you know, we can have a lot of fun along the way. But as Alan Kay says, the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and it starts with just one little bet. So that's that. And I would just finally say the revolution will be improvised.